Most tank crews were not killed by the shot that hit them. They died in the seconds after. Inside a fighting vehicle, fire did not behave like it does in the open. It did not flicker gently. It did not crawl slowly across surfaces. It detonated into existence, a wall of pressure, fuel vapor, atomized hydraulic fluid, burning paint, and oxygen being consumed faster than lungs could understand. Men who had trained for years to fight steel suddenly found themselves fighting air, and in those seconds, when a crewman caught fire, doctrine ended completely. A tank was designed as a system of protection above all else. Armor thickness was measured in millimeters, angles calculated precisely to deflect incoming energy. Crews memorized penetration tables and silhouette profiles with dedication. They learned to keep hatches oriented away from likely threats, to minimize exposure at all times, to trust in steel geometry and ballistic science. Survival was supposed to be mathematical, predictable, and controlled. But the interior of a tank was not a bunker. It was a sealed machine room built around explosives and flammable materials. Fuel tanks lined the hull in careful arrangements. Hydraulic lines fed the turret traverse mechanism. Lubricants coated every moving part. Ammunition, propellant in silk bags, brass casings, high explosive fillers sat inches from knees and elbows throughout the fighting compartment. Electrical wiring ran like veins through every panel and surface. Ventilation was always a compromise between fresh air and sealed protection against poison gas. In training diagrams, these were labeled as components. In combat, they became atmosphere waiting to ignite. Armies knew this terrible truth. They built doctrine around speed and immediate action. If hit, assess damage immediately. If penetrated, fight the fire without hesitation. If fire spreads beyond control, evacuate at once. Seconds were built into procedures like margins in a blueprint. 3 to 5 seconds to identify the source. 2 to grab extinguishers from their mounts, 1 to shout commands across the compartment, another to reach the hatch mechanism. It looked orderly on paper and in training films. Paper did not account for flame entering through a hole the width of a coin. When an armor-piercing round punched through steel plating, it did not arrive alone. A jet of superheated metal fragments and spall followed immediately. Splinters moving faster than the eye could track or the mind could comprehend. They ricocheted inside the compartment wildly, striking equipment, flesh, wiring, and ammunition storage. Anything combustible became fuel instantly. Anything pressurized became a torch spraying fire. The first sensation survivors described was not heat, surprisingly. It was pressure. A heavy slap in the chest, ears compressing painfully, air displaced violently. Then came brightness, sudden and directionless, like being inside a camera flash that did not end or fade. The smell followed last. Burning insulation, hot oil, and something sweet and metallic that meant equipment had become something else entirely. Training said clearly, fire, bail out. Reality asked a harder question. Who could still move? The driver sat low in the hull, legs stretched forward awkwardly, shoulders trapped between transmission housing and armor plate. To exit successfully, he had to pull himself backward through a narrow hatch or rely on the turret crew to open space above him. The gunner and loader were locked inside the turret basket, knees braced uncomfortably against ammunition racks. The commander stood highest in the cupola, but height meant being closest to the turret roof, where spall often sprayed first and hardest. When one of them caught fire, it was rarely seen clearly by the others. Flames inside a tank did not look like campfire flames dancing. They clung to surfaces hungrily, ran along sleeves rapidly, burned invisible in fuel vapor clouds. A man might only know because someone shouted his name in a different voice entirely. Your arm, your arm. The instinct was to swat, to wipe frantically, but gloves could melt against skin. Fabric could fuse permanently. Extinguishers were clipped to brackets, red cylinders meant to be grabbed without looking in darkness. Yet brackets jammed when metal warped from heat. Pins stuck in their housings, powder discharged in blinding clouds that choked lungs and hid exits completely. Outside the tank, the enemy saw something else entirely different. A hit registered. A brief flash on armor appeared. Maybe smoke rose from the hull. Through a sight or optic, the vehicle remained a shape to be engaged again immediately. Doctrine said to fire until the target brewed up completely, until hatches opened with fleeing crew, until movement stopped entirely. Hesitation meant being hit in return by surviving gunners. Inside the stricken vehicle, time stretched impossibly. One British crewman later recalled that the fire made no sound at first, only the whine of the turret motor still trying to traverse because someone's hand was locked on the control in spasm. Another remembered thinking the intercom had failed completely because shouting produced no recognizable words, just air forced through a throat that could not coordinate breath with sound. When a crewman was burning, the others faced a problem no manual could soften or address. The path to survival ran directly through him. Hatches in combat were often locked down securely to prevent blast overpressure or fragments from entering. Releasing them required reaching across the turret with deliberate motion. If the burning man stood between the latch and the rest of the crew, someone had to push past heat and panic to operate it. There was no room to be careful or gentle. Elbows met armor sharply. Boots slipped on spilled oil and hydraulic fluid. Visibility narrowed to shapes and shadows. On the other side of the battlefield, opposing tankers lived with the same arithmetic daily. German crews in the east spoke of the 5-second rule. If you were not out in 5, you were part of the vehicle forever. Soviet crews joked grimly that the tank would be their coffin or their stove, nothing in between. American training films showed diagrams of flame suppression systems working perfectly, as if plumbing could negotiate with physics. All sides learned that ammunition design changed outcomes, but not fundamentals entirely. Wet stowage reduced catastrophic explosions significantly, but propellant still burned fiercely. Diesel fuel ignited less readily than gasoline, but hydraulic fluid did not care about doctrine or fuel type. Improvements bought seconds, not immunity from fire. In those seconds, human decisions became mechanical and automatic. A loader whose sleeve was on fire might still try to pass a round to the gun. Muscle memory did not shut off with pain immediately. Commanders slapped at flames on shoulders while still calling targets over the radio network. Voices flattening into procedure. Someone always tried to save the tank desperately, turning off electrical systems, reaching for engine cutoffs, because a disabled vehicle meant infantry exposed behind them, a line weakened dangerously, a plan unraveling somewhere beyond the smoke. But eventually someone shouted the word that ended all arguments: out. Getting out was not escape. It was exposure to new dangers. A tank on fire drew attention like a flare across the battlefield. Machine guns searched for hatches opening. Artillery observers marked the grid coordinates. Infantry fired reflexively at silhouettes emerging from steel hulks. Crews knew this reality. They delayed evacuation longer than logic advised because the vehicle, burning or not, still felt like cover from bullets. Inside, a burning crewman changed that calculation instantly. Flames spread through shared air rapidly. Skin contact transferred heat directly. A man thrashing in a confined space could block movement, snag equipment, pull others down with him. Comrades who had shared rations hours earlier now measured distances around him carefully. Some tried to smother flames with hands, with jackets, with whatever cloth was within reach. Others focused only on the hatch above, not from cruelty or abandonment, from narrowing probability and survival instinct. A Soviet gunner described pushing his friend toward the commander's cupola because it was the only opening not jammed shut. The friend did not climb out. He leaned forward, arms rigid, as if bracing against invisible wind. The gunner said he thought, briefly, that his friend was refusing to leave for some reason. Later he understood muscles were no longer receiving instructions from the brain. German after-action reports used antiseptic phrases. Crew incapacitated by internal fire. American reports wrote, burn casualties efficiently, and moved on to ammunition expenditure statistics. Language protected planners from images. Inside the vehicles, words were shorter and more desperate. Move, down, go. Once a hatch opened, oxygen rushed in hungrily, often feeding the fire behind explosively. Light from outside, bright and indifferent, cut through smoke. The first man out did not look back at his vehicle. He dropped, rolled, crawled away from the hull to avoid secondary explosions. Training said 50 feet minimum. Many made 10 before collapsing. The last man out carried the longest memory. He had been closest to the burning crewman throughout. He had felt heat through fabric against his skin, heard sounds that did not fit the word voice anymore. He might have tried to pull, to drag, to beat at flames that returned as soon as hands withdrew. At some point, he chose the hatch over everything else. On the battlefield, the opposing side saw figures emerging, some already burning, some stumbling blindly. Fire was contagious in dry grass, in spilled fuel, in fear itself. Soldiers fired because movement meant threat. Later they would remember shapes, not faces with names. Effectiveness had a price that no side escaped entirely. Tanks allowed armies to cross open ground under fire, to break lines that would have held against infantry alone. They concentrated force. They also concentrated risk. The very design that protected against bullets created a chamber where heat multiplied exponentially. Engineers responded with better suppression systems, automatic extinguishers triggered by infrared sensors. They added blow-off panels to vent ammunition explosions upward away from crew. They redesigned fuel storage continuously. Each improvement reduced probabilities by fractions. Crews still memorized bailout drills constantly. War after war, the pattern repeated endlessly. North Africa, where heat outside already baked metal unbearably. Eastern Front winters, where crews wore layers that caught fire more easily. Pacific Islands, where humidity turned smoke into choking soup instantly. Korea's hills, Middle Eastern deserts, European training grounds where exercises tried to simulate what could not be safely rehearsed realistically. Instructors spoke calmly about fire triangles, fuel, oxygen, heat. They demonstrated extinguishers on controlled blazes methodically. They did not simulate a friend's sleeve igniting while the radio crackled with orders and the turret motor screamed. Morality inside a burning tank narrowed to survival and proximity alone. No one entered a vehicle planning to abandon a comrade ever. No one trained to leave someone behind deliberately. Yet history is filled with tanks found later, blackened, hatches open, one body half out as if paused between decisions. Those who survived carried a specific silence. They did not speak first about the enemy round hitting, they spoke about the seconds after. The smell in their nostrils days later, the way their hands kept moving in sleep as if searching for latches. Medals, victories, unit citations did not reach that memory. Across lines, former enemies recognized each other in that detail. At reunions decades later, veterans compared the same gestures. How they rolled on the ground to put out sparks on clothing, how they counted crew members in their heads long after the war ended. Steel had divided them. Fire had been shared. Military manuals continued to refine procedures endlessly. New tanks featured spall liners, automatic halon systems, segregated ammunition compartments. Casualty statistics improved, survival curves shifted, but every crew climbing into a turret still performed an unspoken calculation. Trust in design versus acceptance of physics. When historians map battles, they mark arrows and objectives. They measure kilometers gained, vehicles lost, enemy formations shattered. What they cannot map are the small interior wars fought in spaces barely large enough for 4 men and a machine gun. A tank on fire was not a symbol. It was a room where decisions collapsed into reflex. In the aftermath, recovery teams opened hulls to catalog damage. They photographed penetration points, noted ammunition cook-offs, recorded whether suppression systems had activated. Sometimes they found personal items fused to surfaces, watches, photographs, letters, not as relics, but as evidence of heat duration. Reports moved upward, lessons were extracted, designs were altered. The next generation of crews climbed in with slightly better odds and the same understanding. Armor stopped many things, but not all consequences. Those who had been inside remembered the moment when a human outline blurred in flame and the path to the hatch narrowed to a choice no doctrine could make for them. They lived with the knowledge that survival had required motion in one direction only. Long after wars ended, some still avoided small rooms with locked doors. Some kept windows open in winter. The body did not forget what it meant to fight for air. A tank crew that bailed out together rarely spoke about who exited first or last. They spoke about the driver who did not answer roll call, the loader whose gloves were found by the hatch, the commander who kept giving orders even as smoke filled the intercom. They remembered tasks, not judgments. Steel cooled. Paint was reapplied. New crews took the same vehicles into new conflicts under new flags. The interior dimensions did not change much. Knees still pressed against ammunition racks. Hands still rested on the same latches. And somewhere in every armored unit's history is a vehicle that did not die from the shot that hit it, but from the seconds after, when fire turned protection into confinement, when training met air that would not stay breathable, and when men learned that the most dangerous part of a tank was the space they trusted to keep them alive.